And with Colin. Colin, how you doing?
Doing well. Excited for a conversation today.
Absolutely. So, like you all know, we're grateful to have Salto Systems help us put this together, and Colin joins every single week, and we have a conversation about verticals. And this week's vertical, we talked in last week about enterprise, and said we were going to talk about house of worship this week. And very, very excited to have Simon join us, and we'll have you, Simon, do an introduction on yourself. But I think just from our pre-talk that we had real quick, it's going to be right in line with a lot of what you've heard from us in the past, and really just applied to the house of worship vertical. So without further ado, let's, Simon, if you don't mind, would you introduce yourself real quick, give us a little bit of your background. It's super interesting looking at your website, and we have some mutual friends in the industry. So I think it'd be really, really important for the listeners to get an idea of who you are and where you've come from and what you focus on. So if you don't mind, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Well, Lee and Colin, firstly, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to talk to you today. And for your listeners and viewers, my name is Simon Osamoh, and I'm the founder of Kingswood Security Consulting. Our first address, that I'm a Brit living in America. I've been in America for 10 years. When I was in the UK, I was a detective investigating organised crime, and one of the pinnacles of my career was working with the British Security Services in 2006 into the liquid bomb terrorism plot, which obviously changed aviation security worldwide for limiting liquids on planes. And when I moved to America in 2011, I found myself as the head of counterterrorism at Mall of America. So if anyone's outside the US, it's North America's largest retail and entertainment complex. It's around 6.5 million square feet and around 45 million visitors per year. So a large piece of infrastructure. And it was really there that a police officer one day said, "Simon, you're a Christian. You know, you're an ex-detective, you're a security expert. Can you come and talk to my church about safety and security?" And at that point, I didn't know too much about church or house of worship safety, and I went to a church one Wednesday evening, Lee. I gave a short presentation, and I came away feeling, wow, there is a lot of unmanaged risk around this non-profit organisation, and I've really felt compelled to help non-profit organisations ever since. I've gone on to write 2 books. I've got 2 companies focused on it, and it's really where my heart and passion is, and I help sort of churches in around 25 different states here in the US around risk management. So that's sort of an elevator pitch of Simon Osamoh, Lee and Colin. There you go.
No, I appreciate that very much. And curious though, how you're specific too, which I appreciate the niches of niches, if you would, because there's I think it's, there's a market there. I mean, we found it with our business of focusing on access control as an area, and people thought we were nuts when we first did it. And then you realize you dig into it, and there's a lot of places. But why specifically churches and not just generic house? Are there differences between them, or is it just where you found your passion because being a Christian yourself, that's where you did it? But are there differences?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything is, so I say I support houses of worship, but I am a Christian. And what I say to people is that pretty much most faith denominations, I've overlaid my security principles and they work anywhere. Security is security. It's a different mindset. But the reason why I've got very nichely is surrounding the culture and environment. Of my book, I have 7 steps, 7 principles that I teach churches. And the first thing is to understand your security culture. And the first thing that you find, most organizations, I do a small amount of for-profit work. And a for-profit would come to me and say, "Simon, we want to keep these harmful things out of our environment. We want to keep our people safe." The reason why it's important, and I found success having a niche specifically with churches, is churches are the opposite, Lee and Colin. They're saying, we have this brokenness inside our building. People are saying, we don't want it here. We want to help you. We want your help to manage that risk. So it's a very different mentality. For-profits often trying to keep the bad person out. Churches are trying to keep that person in because of the faith aspect. They believe that all people can be saved. So they're carrying more risk into their environment in an open door sort of way that I sort of try and help them manage. So that is a very niche mindset that when I meet people from an organisation, quite often they're saying, we don't want you to stop us running this homeless shelter. We don't want you to stop us running this addiction clinic. We don't want you to stop us this prison and reform program. And I say, no, I want you to run those programs, but I'm going to help you manage and understand your risk, and then we'll put controls in place to keep people safe. So it's a very unique skill set and a mindset that you need to work in the area where I am. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we talk about the keeping bad people out to letting the right people in. Can you speak a little bit, because Colin and I have talked about this in the past, where we think that that's actually a shift that's happened predominantly around software, right? Where historically the user experience as an industry we didn't care about. We put barriers up, and it was actually what was a feature of making it hard for people to get in uncomfortable has now become a bug in a lot of ways, because that is actually not how most people want to enter in a space, especially one that they maybe work at or go to the gym or whatever it might be, where they feel like they have a relationship with that place and it should welcome them versus make them identify themselves every single time and act like they've never been there before. Can you speak to a little bit about the fundamentals, if you would, of what that means? And talk about it a little bit, like you talked a little bit about, but a little bit more, like the interesting parts about house of worship and the church and the rest, where it really is based off of, that you have people that have done some things or are going to do some things or thought about doing some things. And that's actually isn't supposed to get in the way of you welcoming them into the space. So how do you do that when the fundamentals of security, like you said, is actually there's friction right there from the beginning?
Yeah, and it's really interesting, particularly in house of worship, because you're coming across a biblical perspective or, some type of higher power, depending on the faith denomination. So the first thing I address is there's often a conflict within the church surrounding, well, what does that open door environment look like? You've mentioned access control. Is open door mean that we've got 20 entrances to our church? We keep all those doors open so anyone can walk inside the building. When I work with churches, I often say open door means that you have a welcoming environment, welcoming environment, but it doesn't mean that because you've got 20 doors in your church, which is 60 years old, you're going to leave those doors open so you don't know who is inside your building. We're going to limit some of those doors. We're going to have 1 or 2 open during the day. We're going to direct all foot traffic into those entrances. You're going to have someone sat on reception, and they're going to greet every person that comes in so they maintain that welcoming feel. But there's a real mindset to this because they want to have a welcoming, open door environment without feeling like we're Fort Knox. A common term that I often get from my clients are, Simon, we don't want this isn't a prison. This is a church. We're an open door. So it's breaking through the mindset of, okay, so we know we're not a prison. We are open door. But what does that look like for us? And what are those barriers to preventing us from keeping our environment safe? Quite often, there's a misconception as to what open door really means. You've got to sort of break through that. And then it's then finding those sort of control points, like I said, about, doing the word of the church, which is to greet every person that walks in. If someone's new, you don't recognize them, reaching out your hand, welcome to Westwood Community Church, what brings you today? Engage into them, to get that welcoming environment, but at the same time, you're doing it for a security lens. And quite often in the world where you and Colin work, it's working to find a security technology that might lock their building down or to give them more of that security, but allowing the public to feel that they're in an open door environment, whereas the facilities operations know I can lock the building down with a button if needs be, and I can change that. But for now, we're open. So it is a real mentality, but get them to really identify what does open door mean for you. That is very different in each faith community as to what that really means. Some churches I'll go to and they'll have a sign outside Lee and Colin that will say, all people are welcome. And I have to sit with them and say, well, what do you mean by that? If I'm a murderer on the run from the police, am I welcome inside your church? Well, yeah, let us think about that. Okay, so not everyone is welcome then. So let's look as to what that means, because you're going to get people that are going to challenge that sign. So hopefully that sort of resonated and answered your question. Please let me know if you need a bit more there.
So I think you've opened the door to another topic that Lee and I have talked about before that I think is fascinating with House of Worship, right? And that is so often the easy part, right? And I don't want to make it sound like that's not a challenge and technology isn't advancing big time there, but the the employee or the resident in a multifamily place, managing their access is the easy part, right? You can give them credentials, you know who they are, you can do biometrics, whatever it is. But visitors are always the challenge. In the house of worship, is the congregation visitors? Is the congregation a user of the access control system? How do you manage? Because in my mind, I look at the employees of the church and then the congregation, and basically there's 1,000 visitors, 100 visitors, depending on the size of the church. You're getting visitors every day, and that's always the difficulty. So how do you approach kind of who's who within a church or a
and that's a great question, Colin. I think what I advocate for and what I practice are that you need physical security measures that could be, the access control. But in a church where fundamentally everyone that presents himself would be allowed into the building, because the belief is that they've come to be saved, they've come to find sanctuary in the Lord, whatever their faith beliefs are. What you have to do is overlay that with human behavior detection. And again, that gets into a very sticky and sometimes controversial subject in a house of worship. The person on reception has to let that person into the building because it's an open door. We can't judge them on appearance. We can't judge them why they're here. We just want to let them come in the building because potentially that's someone that could be saved. But then you've got to overlay human behavior detection for that person to make an assessment, so that can then work with your physical security measure. And that is also another challenging subject. We can go down a rabbit hole there. That could be for a part 2, guys.
Yeah,
but that is another one.
But what's interesting too, that you speak to a couple of things. Number one, I think we're starting to see campuses both in college and university and K through 12, as well as I think now on offices where there is this idea that they want them to be open, but without being a prison, and in some respects that they have on that side as well. So there's some similarities that I could see. So something you also mentioned in here, the security industry sometimes doesn't like to separate safety from security, and the feeling of security is very different than the practices of it, and almost to a point where it's like we're purists because we're practitioners, in that we sometimes, I think, lose sight of what the overall goal is. But it sounds like, though, for house of worship, the actual feeling of safety is somewhat as important as the aspects of security. Am I hearing you right, or yes, no?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Because fundamentally, again, in that environment, if we take a Christian faith as to where I am, you might have a pastor, a reverend, or a father overseeing their church. Part of their goal, biblically and scripturally, is to shepherd and to oversee the safety of their flock. So that can have a wide variety of meanings. It could even be that there's two people that are in conflict in a relationship. There's a husband and a wife. There's a non-contact order. That husband might present himself at the church because he knows where little Jimmy's going to be, and there's a court order saying he's not there for little Jimmy. That pastor has to minister the wife, he has to minister the son, he has to minister the person who the law has said you can't go there. So the safety aspect of it is very wide. It's overlaid by a sort of a religious belief, and then it's an acceptance quite often of risk, which we don't find in many other environments. So there's numerous facets to it, Lee, but fundamentally the church is there to make sure that everyone is safe in a wide variety, in a sort of a wide definition as to what that means. Each sort of behaviour can lead to an item of safety. That safety can lead to a security measure.
So, kind of playing off this from what I'm hearing is we're in a lot of the verticals that we're talking about today. The software and technology change is really driving an experiential change, right? And demanding that security and experience are kind of weighed and balanced, where security used to be here and experience was here, right? Now we're trying to balance that. it sounds like in the house of worship, it's almost more of a balance between um, the mental health challenges and the behavioral side, and almost policy and procedural aspects are maybe even more critical than some of the technology that you're seeing and the software that you're seeing. Is that a fair statement? And do you want to elaborate on that at all?
Yeah, I think so, because most houses of worship will have programs around addiction, chemical dependency. It could even be sexual addiction. Prisoner reform programs. Homelessness. The very mission is to help people less fortunate than ourselves. And so I don't believe that houses of worship don't understand the risk. They've always just managed it in a different way, perhaps. And I think now becomes the balance between the experience, manage that risk, and also the outward expectation of society now, where we're seeing more mass sort of murders within churches, Sutherland Springs, so many different things. That's changing the mindset, where the congregation now are calling for more security measures to protect against their program. So I think you're right. I think the sort of experience is key. I think the risk has always been there, which has been accepted, which you don't find in a lot of organizations, because that's the fundamental of their mission. But I think the balance now becomes, how do you overlay that with a sort of a physical security measure to make sure they have that experience, knowing there's people in the congregation that I go to a school and my son's school has a public safety officer there. Why don't you have one here?
On that point, because I could imagine this is the type of area that where people, there's also history of sort of the what's the right term I'm looking for? There's an aspect of it that there's habitual type, like this is how I've always run a church, is how we go. When you start to introduce technology measures, it may take away some of that intimacy that you'd expect. Like actually yesterday going past, there's a church not too long. You had, I believe it's the pastor. I apologize. I'm Jewish. We don't have a church where this is the thing. We're out front shaking hands and meeting the community and doing that, right? So like from a security standpoint, I'm watching that being like, oh, that's interesting. The sort of the threat is now moved outside the building, so you lose some control. And I was like, oh, if they had, some sort of technology here, this and that, it would make it probably safer, but then it would also probably get in the way of some people's perception about how the experience is. So you got to balance that. And so, which leads me to, what are some of the technologies that you're starting to see get implemented that are adding value, that are helping maybe increase the level of safety and security while also helping deliver a better experience overall?
Yeah, and I think if we take recent sort of mass killings in churches, and I don't mean to scare anyone that could be listening to us, but that is reality of it. You've got Sutherland Springs, 26 people, killed. You've got, West Freeway Baptist, another Texas church. A lot of those, the assailant is already in, So where I advocate for is, let's try and identify that risk and manage that risk before it even gets in the building. And most houses of worship have greeters, ushers, people on the door welcoming people. So, that is the best way to try and prevent the danger, capture it before it's even in. But when it then gets inside, the biggest question that I'm seeing, Lee and Colin, is, well, how do we then secure our building? How do we lock it down? Whether the church is 70, 80 years old, a lot of churches I go to, they can't even lock internal doors. They've all got glass inside. So the government's run, hide, fight doesn't even work, because you're going into a classroom with old-fashioned glass in there. So there's nowhere for them to hide. So a lot of churches are moving towards sort of access control technology to be able to lock down their building at a sort of a press of a button. And a lot of them are sort of tending to go towards Homeland Security grants to try and get that funding. But I would say, I represent a lot of churches in different states. And if you ask me my number one right now, it'd be access to control to be able to lock down their building in the event of sort of an active shooter or an active threat style situation.
Are there technologies or maybe things that you would need that you're not seeing from the marketplace? So I ask that as somewhat of a loaded question, because my belief is that we iterate off of a lot of this type of stuff, and and some of the innovation that's needed around it may or may not be there yet. So as you look at it, is there an area, as someone who assesses safety, that you're like, I wish we had this type of thing? What would that type of thing be?
Yeah, and I think this technology might be out there. I mean, I work with some large churches, sort of $50, $60 million. You'd call them really a corporation in our world, down to a church where a pastor is doing this part time. He's got a $40,000 a year day job, and he's also a minister. So I work with the two extremes. But what you often find is that when the first person opening the building or the last person locking the building has to go round room by room and mentioning some of the programs and risks that they have about, addiction clinics. I've never seen a technology where a one-person volunteer, little old Maggie, who's 75 years old, she's been trusted to close down the church, where can she turn all the lights off with a switch of a button? Or can she turn all the lights on at a button, if I can say the word? So when she's walking round into those rooms, she feels more secure that at least she can see the building. Otherwise, little Maggie's got to walk into every room and turn the light on to check that it's actually a safe environment and there's no one in there. Chances are, if there's an assailant in there and all the lights come on automatically, they're going to be looking for the biggest exit because crime is about displacement. They don't want to be there, they're going to leave. So I think looking at the style of people that work in a church, elderly volunteers, people outside risk management, some type of technology where all those lights could come on in one button is going to provide them that sense of security, because that's what a lot of security is that feeling of safety, right, isn't it? So yeah, but if that makes sense, but that's something I've not seen, and I feel would really help a lot of volunteers.
Colin, yeah. Oh, that's great.
No, I mean, this has been fascinating for me, and I think it brings to light, for business partners and installation companies and people who are getting those calls from houses of worship. It's a different conversation, right? And you have to start there. And I think, from my experience, I've sold security to churches and schools and synagogues and things of that nature. And far too often the idea of, well, it's a nonprofit, there's not money to be spent, and things of that nature often get in the way of the real conversations that need to be had. And so I guess that would kind of be where I would go with the last question, Simon, is how are churches and house of worship funding some of these things? You mentioned Homeland Security grants, but have you found success with a certain style of fundraising? Do they need one single big donor to get behind it? How have
you want me to give away my secret juice here, Colin, as to how I survive? Yeah. So here's what I would say. A good friend of mine, she's former US Marshal, Tina Rowe in Colorado, and she always says, Simon, share your stuff, because it's not you doing it if someone else gets it. So I'm less protected now about my secret sauce. But here's one thing I would say, and this is how I start off my meetings. That if you don't feel safe, I won't go to the church. If I don't go to church, I can't give the church my money, my treasure, my offering. If the church doesn't get my money, they can't then do the ministry to help people within their community and far afield. If you're not doing the ministry, then you're no longer a church. You're just someone that has a 501(c) status and other things that the government says you are. So I tie that back, because if people don't feel safe, they won't come to a church. So believe me, I mean, I'm not going to say, the church can be rung and there's a lot of money in there. But, by nature, churches are very well secure. They have funding. What you've got to get in the mindset is well, if I've got Simon, who is a recovering addict, and then you're asking me to spend $5,000, $10,000 on a security system, we'd rather put our money into ministry than what we would do into the security cameras that are, could be considered a sort of reactive tool. So again, it's a mindset surrounding what's the expectation of you, what does the law say? And by putting those cameras, you're going to get this sense of feeling of safety and stuff. So there's a little bit of my source, and there's a method as to how to do it, but it's that convincing them, not why they need the software, but convincing them that if people don't feel safe, fundamentally they're not going to come to the building, and you won't be a church if you can't do the work. So they do have the money. You've got to try and help them understand.
I appreciate that.
What
I like that
management is.
It's actually this is where I think we see a lot of the opportunity is that as things go on, whether it's churches, schools, office buildings, whatever, this idea that safety is a fundamental piece of like this trust building of people feeling to come out. And it starts at a lot of that where it doesn't get as much of a conversation till typically afterwards of maybe something bad happened to the rest. But it's really it's an opportunity that our industry has to lead the conversation more than we historically have. And I think it does come down to not only the safety, but then also having to able to show them other benefits like you did there. That's a good story, if you would, to get them to say, here's why you have to have safety. It's sort of this like virtuous cycle of how you fundamentally work and can be what you want to be. So yeah, that's a great way of putting it. So thank you, Simon. We won't take up too much of your time here. This is the beginning, and frankly, of a conversation that Colin and I weren't 100% sure. Not you, but from when we were like, we're going to do House of Worship, two guys that don't necessarily talk about it all the time, right? And around access control, but it's super interesting, and actually, it feels like one of those that, if you fundamentally understand this, there's a lot that can be applied elsewhere that like, because it is such a interesting puzzle to solve around. Here's places you fundamentally want people to come in that are you're inviting risk in and then figuring out how to manage it.
Yeah. A lot of the mission-driven businesses and setups are like that.
Yeah, and honestly, I go to so many places where physical security companies or consultants have said to the person, you shouldn't be doing this. And I'm trying to think if there'd ever be an example where I'd say no. And I don't believe there is one, because the mission of the church is to help people that have fallen on hard times in their life, that are those people in society that we either tend to walk past, ignore, or want to pretend that aren't there. So you've really got to understand that is their mission. They're going to come to you looking for a yes. And as a consultant, you've got to be creative and think, well, how can I solve this problem for them in a sort of conventional way, and not overlay your morals, your feelings, your emotions over it, because that might not be where that faith community really is. The risk is theirs, and you're there to help them manage it as best as possible, knowing that they have a belief system behind it. So it is why how we started the conversation, is why I love to niche here, because it's very fascinating. Each house of worship I go to has a very different understanding as to what safety and security really means. And even I'm shocked. I've been doing this 10 years, but I'm still shocked, but I still find a way to help them. It's like, what now? You're crazy, right?
Well,
now, okay, let's think about this. What can we do here?
Hopefully this will be the beginning of many, many other conversations, and would love to have you come on later on too, and as we continue to discuss this. So thank you.
I'd be happy to come back.
And Simon, if somebody wanted to learn more about your company and what you do, where should they go look? Yeah,
thanks, Colin. So it's just at kingswoodsc.com. Kingswoodsc.com is my risk management consulting company. On there's actually a church page with information. So I don't know if you have show notes or a link, but you can put that in there in case they want to struggle with my English accent. But just kingswoodsc.com.
No, we will.
Yes.
No, we'll add that in there, and then I recommend. I went on and looked at your videos; they're very well done. You have a very unique way of storytelling that I would tell people in our industry to go take a look at, because you do a really nice job of presenting it. You can tell that you spend the time thinking about. It's not just the bits and the bytes of what's there; it's around the story of how you present it. So it's a great example of somebody that understands storytelling. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Lee.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you
Take
very
care.
much.